Let's talk about the horror film in a violent nature. So we already have a review. We're going over spoilers here, but if you don't want any spoilers, definitely go check out our review. We watched this one at Sundance. It was probably the first movie we watched all year, honestly. And I want to talk about the whole film and its ending because I think it's a very interesting ending. And I will tell you, the first time I watched it at Sundance, I was just left bewildered by this movie. I wasn't sure what to feel for it. I wasn't sure if I hated it or I loved it. So I was caught in the middle. I got a chance to watch it again recently, and I definitely do really appreciate what it's doing, but at the same time, I can tell you this isn't a film for everybody, because if you're not somebody who really likes these very drawn out and methodically made films like this, it's definitely going to be a film that will challenge you to really push yourself to stay tuned, because it's a film that is slow. It does take its time. It sets up things longer than any horror film I've seen in a long time. And so it's really one of those films that is different. But I do want to applaud that it's trying to be different and trying to push for something that we haven't seen in the slasher genre. Slasher, I said that with so much emphasis. But slasher genre, where we follow this serial killer. We see their perspective of everything they're doing. It kind of sets up a different, eerier sort of tension where you're in the perspective of the killer, you're overhearing the campers, and you're just waiting and anticipating for this killer to get close to them. Before we get into the video, I want to let you know that we're trying to get to 35,000 subscribers. We've got a ton of giveaways and videos coming all summer, so stay tuned for those. So hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, follow us on our social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all provided down below, as well as our website, www.culturelixir.com. But the film basically revolves around this killer named Johnny, and Johnny has this backstory to them. 70 years prior to the film, Johnny's father actually owned this logging company, and the lumberjacks had it out for Johnny's dad because Johnny's dad was apparently jacking up the prices of things, all of that. And they also were pretty pissed about Johnny playing around the area. One day, one of the lumberjacks actually trips on the toy car that Johnny plays with and breaks their ankle. What they eventually do is they lure Johnny out to the fire tower and try to give him a scare. But the scare goes very wrong, and Johnny ultimately falls and dies from the tower. Then his father is murdered, and this is all covered up by the lumberjacks and the logging company. And what eventually happens is that a couple of time passes on, and then there is this massacre that happens where all the lumberjacks are found torn to shreds, and it's passed off as a bad case of food poisoning, and maybe some animals came through and they pretty much ripped them apart. That's what's passed off as the official massacre that happened. Apparently happens is some of the locals say, no, that's not what we saw. We saw some guy wearing a firefighter mask and they pretty much killed the lumberjacks. That's what we saw. And so this story has been passed on now that it was Johnny's vengeful spirit that came back to get revenge on the murder of their father and their accidental death because of the lumberjacks as well. And that's basically the whole core of what Johnny's backstory is, sort of giving you similar vibes to the Friday the 13th, where Jason's accidental drowning and stuff like that because of the camp counselor's neglect and things like that, sort of in that vein, right? So that's Johnny's story. So what ties Johnny to this forest? Well, there is a locket that Johnny actually received from their late mother that was given to them by their father, and this locket is basically what starts the curse from the beginning, because at the beginning of the film we see that somebody takes the locket, and that's where Johnny initially is sort of resuscitated of sorts. He then goes on a journey to try and find this locket, wherein he encounters Chuck. Chuck is this asshole who's this poacher setting up bear traps and stuff like that, and Johnny passes by a fox that has been sort of taken by this bear trap who is decomposing. And it's very interesting how this is sort of setting up to what's about to happen to Chuck, because we see as Chuck is fighting with a local, talking about how they need to stop putting out these traps, that they're dangerous and all of that, and Chuck is just not having it. So eventually we see as Johnny goes into Chuck's house, and Chuck gets pissed and he's telling him he's gonna shoot him, all of this. And then once he sees Johnny, who just looks like a zombie, he starts to get scared, and we see that there is a locket there. So we do see that Johnny gets pissed at Chuck and goes on to kill him and then take the locket, but it's not the locket of his mother, it's just Chuck's locket that he has. So it's not really what Johnny was looking for, and so he heads back out on his journey. Johnny is then able to come across the group of friends who did actually steal the necklace, and they're all in the campfires. One of the friends, Aaron, is there, and he's the one who actually tells the story of Johnny to the rest of the group. So we see as Johnny picks them apart one by one, of course the biggest one being the yoga kill scene, which was just one of the most insane scenes. So watching that for the first time ever on the big screen with a full audience at Sundance was definitely one of the highlights of the whole trip for me, because everybody was just reacting in a different way. People were like having their hands in their face, people were like looking away, people were like screaming. It was just insanity. And this was very early, I will say. It was around like 11 or 12 p.m. when we were watching this, and everybody, I think if you weren't awake, you were awake after that, because that was one of the gnarliest scenes, honestly, because man, it's indescribable, right? Eventually, the only ones that survive team up with a park ranger who actually knows about Johnny and also the 2 massacres that happened. And apparently the ranger and the ranger's fathers were the only survivors of a previous rampage that Johnny had. So the ranger knows how to put Johnny away, and he starts to devise this plan for them to be able to do this. But everything seems to backfire because of time restraints and all of that. And, you know, they weren't quick enough to take Johnny down again. And Johnny's able to finish what he started back with the ranger, and he kills the ranger as we see the other ones try to get away. And so the way that the ranger had told Troy and Chris, who are the only survivors right now, that the only way to put Johnny down is to pretty much bury them by the fire tower and leave them there. However, Johnny's able to catch up to them pretty quickly and beats Troy senselessly for a long time. And this goes on comically long for me, and at a point a little bit too long where I'm just like, okay. But I think it's really just trying to showcase just how savage and how brutal Johnny really is, and that there is no like sense in there. There is nothing in that head, right? Like it is just pure senseless violence. And I'll talk more about that because it really ties into what we're about to hear from this one strange woman who comes to save Chris. So Chris pretty much leaves everything behind, even the locket. And, you know, for a time being, we thought that this was the only way that you can put Johnny down is by returning the necklace. But it turns out that's not the case. You have to do more than just that. But Chris is like, you know what? I'm not going to even have a chance to do this. I'm done. I'm just going to get out of the woods right now. So we see that Chris is rescued by this woman in a pickup truck, and she seems pretty much shell-shocked. The woman drives, and she's a little worried that Chris seems to be bleeding out and all of that, but Chris insists, please do not stop. Let's get as far away as possible from the forest. So the woman tells Chris a story about her brother who used to be a game warden and had a very bad encounter with a bear. The bear apparently had been causing problems in the area, and her brother was sent to check it out. And then that is where the brother finds 2 deer carcasses that had been slaughtered, but they hadn't been eaten by the bear at all. Requested backup because this was very strange, and then he gets caught by the bear by the river. He is mauled and he passes out and then saved by a fellow warden who came by. This is where Chris seems to get interested in asking, what happened to the bear though? So the brother survived in all of this, and the woman told Chris that the brother had passed out. So I thought what was interesting about the woman telling this story to Chris and going through all of this is that Chris's only question is, but what happened to the bear? Not what happened to the brother after or where he went and all of this. And we'll talk about that in a bit because it's important to this story. The woman says no one knows. It was as if it had just gone upstream and left with no issues. Maybe because it saw that maybe the person was already dead and they just wanted to move on. Maybe they just didn't feel like killing them more. You know, that may have been a thing. Chris keeps insisting on wanting to know, but what about the bear? And this is when the woman says this is something called henhouse syndrome, is when predator animals keep killing more prey so they can eat or store for later or simply just leave there. They don't know why the animals do this, but it is something that they need to fulfill, and they can stop at any time. It's just whenever they feel fulfilled in this rage or this like killing spree, they want to go on it. And we see as Chris tries to piece this together with Johnny almost, and thinking about how Johnny goes on these killing sprees, these massacres from time to time, and there is no stopping them until Johnny is fulfilled. And so what I found interesting about those two things in this story that the woman's saying is Chris's reaction to both of them, because Chris is so like fixated on knowing, but what happened to the bear? Did they kill it? Did it go away? What exactly is going on with it? Because this is her same feeling she has for Johnny right now. Johnny just seems to have been banished from her life now after doing all of this very traumatic and very like horrifying and brutal killings. Johnny is just gone. There's no recollection of it from anybody. Nobody knows exactly what happened except for Chris, and that sort of lingers in her that this is something she will have to live on with. And I think the idea of not having closure in her life is something that really is eating away at Chris right now, because there is so much brutality that she has witnessed in these last couple of days, and nothing will seem to close that chapter because she doesn't know what happened to Johnny. She doesn't know when Johnny's going to come back, if he will ever come back. Johnny's out there. She doesn't know if Johnny can get out of the woods and come look for her. So there's always this sense of I'm never going to be safe again, which I think is something interesting that is explored here, because a lot of times in horror films, just as this movie flips the genre on its head by following the killer's perspective instead of the survivors, you see this movie end not right as the final girl escapes, but it ends a little bit after. So you get a little bit more of a sense of how a final girl really feels, because they really have this feeling of, I just went through all of this traumatic experience and I don't know if I'll ever be okay. In this sense, Chris doesn't know that. Chris doesn't know if she'll ever be okay. She doesn't even know if Johnny's dead or gone, or if Johnny can come after her. So I think it really sets up this sense of dread and tension for her the rest of her life. And I think what's interesting as well is that the locket is gone from where Chris left it as well at the end, as we get that final shot where Chris had left the locket and placed it on the gasoline container, and now it's not there at the end, meaning that Johnny is pretty much still roaming around, because at the beginning of the film when Johnny was put down and was left there, the locket was just hanging there when somebody went to grab it. Could it mean somebody else was in the woods and grabbed it? It definitely leaves it all up for interpretation, but I think this very much so goes to what Chris is feeling, is this sense of, I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know, where do I go with my life now? Is Johnny ever going to be following me again? And I think that really makes it that much more scary to think. The buzzing sounds of the flies as well at the end when Chris is looking out into the horizon, into the forest, reinforces that, because now Chris will associate those flies with Johnny anytime she hears them, even if they don't really have anything to do with Johnny. Maybe if she hears them years from now. It's sort of how I think things trigger people that have post-traumatic disorder, and how that is definitely one thing for Chris now, is these fly sounds, these buzzings, these sort of woods are now associated with Johnny, and that will never go away again. And Johnny may not appear physically anymore for Chris, but mentally they will always have that very horrible reminder what Johnny did, and for years and years to come. So I thought it was a very interesting way to end the film, and I think that it really is a great way to really showcase just the horrors of violence. And sometimes violence doesn't need any justification or any explanation. It is just, as the woman says, senseless violence. And I think that's what makes it that much more horrifying, sort of like how The Strangers tries to do that as well. But I think that the film here does it a little bit better in that direction, where there is like this sense of dread throughout, because you can't explain it and you don't have that closure for it. So I thought it was a very interesting take on the slasher genre, and I'm excited to see what people think. Like I said, love it, hate it, you won't be in the middle for it, but I think that we can all agree it definitely pushes the genre forward, and it gives us an interesting new take, and hopefully we see some more inspiration from other filmmakers in the future from this. But let me know what you thought about In the Violent Nature. Did you enjoy it? Did you not? Are you very excited to see what Chris Nash does next, or are you on the fence about that? Let me know in the comments down below. But as always, that's going to do it for me on the road to 35,000 subscribers. Tons of giveaways and videos all summer long, so stay tuned, and I'll see you next time. Stay safe, stay positive.